You're spending $800 a year at the grocery store on vegetables that traveled 1,500 miles to reach your plate. And you're doing this while you have a backyard that could produce fresh food every single day of the year. But nobody taught you that a victory garden is not a summer project. It is a permanent system that feeds your family 365 days a year using the same methods that kept millions of families fed during wartime when commercial food supply chains collapsed. And if you do not build this system now using the principles that John Seymour documented from the original victory gardens of World War II, you will spend the next decade watching your family eat industrial vegetables while your yard sits empty and unproductive for 10 months of the year. The reason your backyard is not feeding your family right now is not that you lack space or time or skills. The reason is that modern gardening has convinced you that food production is seasonal, that you plant in spring, harvest in summer, and then you are done until next year. And this is completely backwards because the original victory gardens that fed 40% of America as produce during World War II were designed to produce food continuously through all 4 seasons using crop rotation, succession planting, and preservation techniques that kept families fed when grocery stores were empty or rationed. A victory garden is not a hobby garden. It is a survival system. And the difference between a hobby garden and a victory garden is that a hobby garden produces food when conditions are perfect, while a victory garden produces food regardless of what is happening in the world outside your fence. What I am going to show you the 4-season victory garden system that produces fresh vegetables 365 days a year from a space as small as 600 square feet. This is not theoretical. This is the exact system that Seymour documented from families who fed themselves entirely from their gardens during the 1940s when commercial food was scarce. The system has 4 components that work together. The first component is the deep bed system, which allows you to grow more food in less space. The second component is the succession planting calendar, which tells you exactly what to plant and when. The third component is the preservation system, which converts your summer harvest into stored food for winter. And the fourth component is the cold season production system, which keeps fresh greens producing even when the temperature drops below freezing. Let me start with the deep bed system because this is the foundation of everything else. Seymour writes that the most productive gardens he saw were based on deep beds that were 4 to 5 feet wide and as long as the space allowed. These beds are never walked on. You do all your work from the paths on either side. And the reason this matters is that when you never walk on the bed, the soil stays loose and friable, which means plant roots can penetrate deeply and access nutrients and water from a much larger volume of soil. A conventional row garden might have soil that is only worked to a depth of 6 inches, but a deep bed is cultivated to 18 or even 24 inches deep. And this extra depth allows you to plant vegetables much closer together because the roots are growing down instead of competing laterally for space. Seymour writes that you can grow 3 times as much food from a deep bed as you can from the same area in conventional rows. Here is how you build a deep bed. You mark out a bed that is 4 feet wide and 20 feet long. This gives you 80 square feet of growing space. You dig the entire bed to a depth of 18 inches. Once the bed is dug, you add as much compost as you can get. Seymour recommends at least 2 inches of compost spread across the entire bed and worked into the top 6 inches of soil. This compost provides the fertility that will feed your crops for the entire year. The key is that deep beds require high fertility because you are growing vegetables much more intensively than in a conventional garden. You are packing more plants into less space, and those plants need more nutrients to support their growth. Now here is where the victory garden system becomes practical. You do not need a huge garden to feed your family. Seymour writes that a family of 4 can be fed year-round from 600 square feet of deep beds if those beds are managed properly using succession planting and preservation. That is just 6 beds, each 4 feet wide and 25 feet long. This fits easily in most suburban backyards. And the work required to maintain these beds is less than the work required to maintain a conventional garden of twice the size, because deep beds are more efficient in every way. The second component is the succession planting calendar. And this is where most gardens fail because people plant everything at once in spring and then wonder why they have too much food in August and nothing in October. The Victory Garden system solves this by dividing crops into 4 categories based on their temperature tolerance and maturity time. The first category is early spring crops, which includes peas, lettuce, spinach, radishes, and all the brassicas like broccoli, cabbage, and cauliflower. These crops are planted as soon as the soil can be worked in late winter or early spring. They tolerate frost, they actually prefer cool weather, and they mature quickly so that they are ready to harvest by late spring. The second category is main season crops, which includes tomatoes, peppers, beans, squash, cucumbers, and corn. These crops need warm soil and cannot tolerate frost. So you plant them after the last frost date in spring, and they produce heavily through summer and into early fall. The third category is fall crops, which is actually just a second planting of the early spring crops. You plant lettuce, spinach, kale, broccoli, and carrots again in late summer, and they grow through fall and into winter. The fourth category is storage crops, which includes potatoes, onions, garlic, winter squash, and root vegetables like carrots, beets, and parsnips. Here is the practical succession calendar that Seymour recommends. In February, you plant peas, lettuce, spinach, and radishes in your deep beds. By April, these crops are producing. In March, you plant your brassicas, broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower, kale. In May, after your last frost, you plant tomatoes, peppers, beans, squash, and cucumbers. These are your main season crops, and they produce from July through September. In late June or early July, you plant your fall crops. Another round of lettuce, spinach, kale, carrots, beets, and turnips. These grow slowly through the hot weather, but when fall arrives and the temperature drops, they surge and produce heavily from September through December. In July, you plant garlic for next year's harvest. And you make sure your storage crops are growing well because you will harvest them in October and store them for winter eating. The third component is the preservation system. And this is critical because a Victory Garden is not just about fresh food. It is about stored food that feeds your family when fresh production stops. Seymour writes that the original Victory Gardens preserved 50% or more of their summer harvest through canning, freezing, drying, and root cellaring. Here is how preservation works. In August and September, when your tomatoes, beans, and squash are producing heavily, you eat some fresh and you preserve the rest. You can tomatoes into sauce and whole tomatoes. You freeze beans and peppers. You cure winter squash and store them in a cool, dry place where they keep for 6 months. You harvest your potatoes and store them in a root cellar or a cool basement. You harvest your onions and garlic and hang them to cure. And you harvest your root vegetables like carrots, beets, and turnips and store them in boxes of damp sand in a cool place. This preserved food is what carries you through winter. Because in a true Victory Garden, your summer harvest is designed to produce enough food to preserve for winter eating. The fourth component is the cold season production system. And this is what transforms a Victory Garden from a summer project into a year-round food system. Because even in cold climates, you can produce fresh food through winter using simple season extension techniques. The most effective technique is the cold frame, which is just a bottomless box with a clear lid that sits over a section of your garden bed. The cold frame captures solar heat during the day and protects plants from wind and frost at night. Inside a cold frame, you can grow lettuce, spinach, kale, and other greens through winter even when the outside temperature drops to 20 degrees. Seymour writes that a cold frame extends your growing season by 6 to 8 weeks at both ends. The second technique is mulching, which means covering the soil around your plants with straw, leaves, or compost. Mulch insulates the soil and keeps it from freezing solid, which allows root vegetables like carrots and parsnips to be harvested fresh from the ground all winter. Here is what the Victory Garden looks like in practice through the 4 seasons. In spring, from March through May, you are harvesting peas, lettuce, spinach, radishes, and broccoli from your early plantings. You are planting tomatoes, beans, and squash. In summer, from June through August, you are harvesting tomatoes, peppers, beans, squash, and cucumbers heavily. You are eating some fresh and preserving the rest. You are also planting your fall crops in July. In fall, from September through November, you are harvesting your storage crops. Potatoes, winter squash, onions, garlic, you are digging your carrots and beets and storing them. And you are beginning to harvest your fall crops. Lettuce, spinach, kale, turnips in winter. From December through February, you are eating your stored vegetables. Canned tomatoes, frozen beans, cured squash, stored potatoes. And you are harvesting fresh greens from your cold frames. These greens continue to grow slowly through winter. This is the system for seasons of continuous production using deep beds, succession planting, preservation, and season extension. And the result is that you never buy vegetables at the grocery store. You eat fresh food from your garden every single day. And you have stored food in your pantry that feeds your family when fresh production is limited. Now here is the practical investment required to build this system. In the first year, you will spend about $300 on materials to build your deep beds, cold frames, and basic tools. You will spend money on seeds, which is maybe $50 for a full year's worth of vegetables. And you will need to invest in preservation equipment, canning jars, a pressure canner, freezer bags. This is another $200 to $300, so your total first-year cost is around $600, and in return, you get a garden that produces $2,000 to $3,000 worth of vegetables at grocery store prices. Because every dollar you spend building your Victory Garden returns $3 or $4 in food that you do not have to buy. Here is what this system really means. It means that when food prices spike or supply chains fail, your family eats normally. It means that you walk into your garden every single morning and harvest fresh food for that day as meals. It means that you are not dependent on trucks and warehouses and distribution systems that can fail. This is what Seymour meant when he wrote about self-sufficiency. It is about resilience. It is about having the skills and systems to take care of your family's basic needs. The Victory Garden system works. It worked in the 1940s when millions of families used it to survive wartime rationing. It worked for Seymour and the families he documented, and it will work for you if you build it properly and manage it consistently. You start by building one deep bed this spring, just one. You plant it with early spring crops and main season crops. You harvest through summer, you preserve what you do not eat fresh. And you plant fall crops in midsummer. By the end of your first year, you will understand how the system works. And in year 2, you add more beds and you refine your planting calendar. And by year 3, you have a garden that feeds your family completely. This is the Victory Garden system. Build it now. And never depend on the grocery store again.